How's your heart today? Some endings do not come with one clear moment to point at. No betrayal, no slammed doors. No single sentence heavy enough to explain the distance that followed. Tonight's letters are about relationships that ended without a reason simple enough to repeat to other people. If you have ever struggled to explain why something ended when nobody did anything obviously wrong, maybe these words will sit beside you for a while. Let's begin with the first letter. I still do not know what answer to give when people ask why we broke up. For a while, I used the kind of sentence people accept quickly. I said the timing was off. I said we grew apart. I said we wanted different things. None of those were fully wrong. They just never felt alive enough to hold what really happened. The truth is that our relationship did not fall apart. It slowly lost warmth in places I could not properly name. When we first met, being with you felt easy. We could spend a whole Sunday doing almost nothing and still feel full by the end of it. Grocery runs became conversations in parking lots. We split dumplings, argued about movies, and laughed at the same small, strange things. You knew I got quiet when I was overwhelmed and never forced me to speak before I was ready. I learned how sweet you really liked your coffee. We built a life out of routines so ordinary they felt permanent. That is why I missed the early shift. At first, it was only a change in tone. We still texted, but more practically. We still saw each other, but less spontaneously. We still kissed goodbye, but sometimes it felt like both of us were already halfway inside the next task. Life got heavier in ordinary ways. Work, bills, family things. We kept telling ourselves we were just tired. Maybe we were. But I started feeling lonely beside you. And that confused me more than being alone ever had. You were still kind, still dependable. If I got sick, you checked on me. If I had a bad day, you asked about it. On paper, nothing dramatic was missing. But something softer had started slipping away. Curiosity, maybe. The sense that we were still turning toward each other instead of simply maintaining what we had already built. I remember one night, because of how unremarkable it was. We were eating takeout on my couch, and I mentioned a coworker who had suddenly moved to another city. I expected one of our usual long conversations about fear and change. Instead, you just nodded and said, "That's wild." That was all. It sounds small, but I felt something drop inside me. I realized I had been bringing pieces of myself to the table, and fewer of them were being picked up. Later that night, you fell asleep beside me, and I looked at you with love, tenderness, gratitude, and also panic. Not because anything terrible had happened, but because I no longer knew whether we were still growing or only staying because neither of us had a good enough reason to leave. That was the part I never said. I thought endings required proof. A lie, a cruelty, a betrayal. Something clear enough to explain without sounding ungrateful. You had not hurt me in any obvious way. I had not stopped caring. So I kept treating uncertainty like a mood instead of information. The breakup itself was quiet. You came over after work, and we sat at the kitchen table instead of the couch, which should have told me everything. I made tea neither of us drank. You looked tired, not angry. I was already crying before either of us said much. You said, "I don't think I know how to fix this." And I said, "I don't know what this is." That was the most honest thing either of us had said in weeks. For months after, I kept interrogating the memory like it owed me a better answer. I reread messages, replayed dinners, went back through weekends and silences, convinced there had to be one missing piece that would make the heartbreak make sense. What I know now is less satisfying, but truer. Sometimes love does not end because someone failed. Sometimes the connection slowly stops reaching both people in the way it used to, and effort cannot quietly turn that back into life. I still think of you when I pass the flower stand near the station, because you always bought the discounted bunches and said they deserved to be chosen too. I still make my coffee too sweet on hard mornings. I still sometimes want to tell you small things that only mattered because you knew me while they happened. But I do not think the lack of a clear reason made our ending less real. I think some endings ask us to trust what was quietly true, even when we cannot explain it neatly. Not every relationship breaks loudly. Some simply become a place where love remains, but full arrival does not. Some endings hurt because no one became the villain. The ache comes from leaving something that was still gentle. Here is the next letter. I ended a relationship once, and the hardest part was that I could not explain it without sounding cruel. If I had said he lied, people would have understood. If I had said he was unkind, there would have been sympathy waiting for me in simple sentences. But he was good. He brought me tea when I worked late. He remembered practical things. He texted my mother after her surgery. He tried, in steady and thoughtful ways, to make life easier. So when I started pulling away, I judged myself before anyone else could. At first, I blamed stress. Work was heavy, my apartment had a leak, and my younger sister was calling me every few days because her own heart was breaking. I assumed what I felt was temporary exhaustion, but even after life calmed down, the uneasiness stayed. He would ask where I wanted to go for dinner, and I would feel tired before we even left. He would tell me a story from work, and I would hear myself responding correctly but not naturally. I began to dread the sound of my own politeness. It frightened me because I could feel myself performing care instead of fully living inside it. The strange thing is that I still wanted the relationship to work. I read about communication. I planned weekends away. I suggested phone-free dinners. I lit candles. I said yes to plans I secretly felt too tired for because I thought effort might lead feeling back to us. Sometimes it helped for a few hours. We would laugh, and I would think, there you are. Then the distance would return, not with anger, just with a dull quiet I could not name. One Saturday, we were at a furniture store because he wanted a desk. Around us, couples were choosing lamps and sofas and making casual future plans. He pointed to a table and asked, "Could you see this in our place someday?" There was nothing wrong with the question. That was the problem. It was reasonable, loving, even. But something in me went still instead of warm. I realized then that my uncertainty was no longer passing. It had become a private dishonesty. For weeks, I said nothing because I was terrified of hurting someone who had not done anything terrible. I thought maybe staying a little longer would be kinder than leaving without a stronger reason. But waiting only made me less honest in smaller ways. Delayed replies, distracted hugs, soft deflections whenever he talked about next year. Nothing dramatic enough to count as betrayal, but enough to make me feel like I was standing just outside my own life. The night I ended it, he had cooked dinner, pasta, bread, a simple salad, the kind of evening that would have looked lovely to anyone else. We ate in his kitchen with the window open because it had finally cooled down after a week of heat. He said something funny about work, and I laughed. Then there was a pause that felt like a small empty church. I put my fork down and said, "I need to tell you something before I make this worse by waiting." He got very still. I told him I cared about him, that he had been good to me, that I had been trying for a while to understand why I felt far away even when we were together. I told him I did not have a satisfying explanation, and that was the part I hated most. He asked quietly, "Do you not love me anymore?" I remember how unbearable that question was, because the answer was both yes and no. I loved him. I just no longer loved the relationship in the direction it was going. I no longer believed staying would turn confusion into truth. So I said the most accurate sentence I had. "I care about you too much to keep giving you something that already feels half gone." For a long time, I thought I had done something selfish by leaving without a cleaner reason. Now I think the selfish thing would have been to stay until kindness turned into resentment and uncertainty hardened into routine. I still think of him when I smell toasted bread late at night. I still hope he is loved by someone whose whole heart stays in the room. And I hope he knows the ending was not proof that what we had was false. It was proof that something real can still stop being right. Leaving without a courtroom-ready reason does not always mean someone gave up too easily. Sometimes it means they finally stopped confusing gratitude with certainty. Sometimes we break our own hearts trying to be fair. Sometimes fairness is telling the truth before distance turns into damage. Here is the last letter tonight. The relationship ended long before we admitted it, and I think that is why I grieved it twice. The first grief happened inside the relationship itself, quietly. While we were still shopping for groceries, still texting, home safe, after long days, still showing up at birthdays together like a stable pair. From the outside, nothing looked broken. We were not fighting, we were not betraying each other. We still said love you before hanging up. But I had started to feel the sentence arrive a fraction too late. You were my safest habit for nearly 4 years. My father asked about you by name. Your niece drew me into birthday cards with the wrong hair color and somehow still made me cry. My books were on your shelf. Your hoodies were at my place. We had crossed so many tiny domestic borders that the relationship felt built into the architecture of my life. Maybe that is why I ignored the shift for so long. I thought if a relationship had enough shared evidence, it could survive a loss of inner clarity. But evidence is not the same as aliveness. I remember the afternoon I understood something was ending, even if I refused to call it that. We were in a supermarket choosing fruit for dinner at my parents' house. You were comparing peaches carefully and asking whether my mother would prefer nectarines instead. It was such a tender question, so thoughtful, so you. And I felt a sudden grief so sharp, I had to look away. Because I realized, in the middle of that fluorescent aisle, that I was already grieving someone who was still standing next to me. Not because you had failed me, not because I had stopped caring, but because part of me already knew I could not keep promising a forever, that my heart no longer approached with steadiness. After that, I became hyper-aware of my own hesitation, how I paused before saying next summer, how relief sometimes arrived when plans got canceled, and how guilty that relief made me feel. I kept trying to correct myself internally, as if love were a posture I could hold longer if I just concentrated. When we finally talked, it happened on a weekday evening in my living room. No rain, no suitcase, just 2 mugs on the table and your charger beside the lamp. You kept waiting for the specific reason, the sentence that would make the rest line up. I kept failing to give it because there wasn't one. There were only absences, hesitations, and the painful knowledge that staying had started to feel more explainable than it felt true. You asked me, so what am I supposed to do with that? I still think about that question. Because you were right. A person cannot argue with vagueness. They cannot repair something when the damage is invisible. They cannot improve a version of themselves that was never the actual problem. All I could say was, I know this is unfair in the way honest things sometimes are. After you left, I washed the 2 mugs and cried in a way that felt almost embarrassed. I was not only mourning you, I was mourning the lack of a clean story. I wanted something I could tell friends without watching their faces search for missing pieces. Instead, all I had was a quiet knowing that the relationship had stopped feeling like a place I could fully arrive in. Months later, the shame began to soften. I started to understand that clarity is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the repeated feeling of shrinking when you should be opening. Sometimes it is the body going tired around a future the mouth is still trying to promise. Sometimes it is loving a person and still recognizing that the life between you is no longer growing in a way that asks you both to stay. If I could say one last honest thing to you, it would be this. I did not leave because you were too little. I left because the truth inside me had become too large to keep stepping around. And I am sorry that it arrived without a shape kind enough to hand you. Not every ending comes with a reason people can admire. Some come with only a quiet certainty that staying would have been the louder mistake. If tonight brought someone to mind, maybe your heart is not asking you for a perfect explanation. Maybe it only wants permission to admit that confusion can still be real, and that not all grief comes from obvious harm. Some losses come from the painful honesty of realizing that love is present but alignment is gone. Be gentle with the parts of you that still want a cleaner answer. Some relationships end not because they meant nothing, but because what they meant could no longer carry both people forward.